Good Wednesday afternoon, everybody. I'm meteorologist Tim Pandajis, and today we have got a lot to talk about. The Atlantic has pretty much just awoken from a slumber over the past couple of weeks. 3 separate areas to talk about, 2 in the Atlantic and another one in the Pacific. First, before we get into it, make sure you hit that subscribe button if you're watching this video on YouTube. Hurricane season's ramping on up. We put out these videos almost every single day, so make sure you stay updated and hit that notification bell as well. Let's start off here with our 7th named storm of the year in the Atlantic Basin. That is Gonzalo. We've knocked out a third of all the names put out for 2020 so far. So you may ask yourself this question. As we go forward, at this rate, we could just wipe out all the names before the season's over. What happens then? Well, once we get to Wilfred, we run out of names. We go on to the Greek alphabet, alpha, beta. Last time that happened, and the only time that happened, was in 2005, and you know what season that was, the season of Katrina and several other blockbuster storms. So being the 7th named system of the year, we look at climatology from 1966 to 2009 from the National Hurricane Center. The typical first date on or around for the 7th system is around September 16th. So we are well ahead of time by almost 2 months there. So keep that in mind. All right. Also, Gonzalo is, par for the course with the 2020 hurricane season, another record setter, and it hasn't even been around very long. It is the earliest occurrence of a G-named storm in the Atlantic since records have been kept, and that's been since the 1850s. So a lot of time there. The previous earliest G storm was Gert back in 2005. And as I mentioned, 2005 went on to be a pretty epic season. And there's been a lot of comparisons between 2020 and 2005. But let's break it down because there's really not a huge comparison to talk about here. 7 named storms so far this season through July 22nd today. All of those, so far at least, have been just tropical storms. And pretty much minimal tropical storms at that. We're just going to watch Gonzalo that may become a hurricane. Then you look at 2005. It was a little bit behind in terms of storm count. 6 named storms up through July 22nd. But the difference is here. 3 of them were tropical storms. 3 were hurricanes. Of those 3 hurricanes, 2 were major. Dennis and Emily, Category 4 and Category 5 storms. And here we are only at the end of July, pretty much very early in the season. So although we may be outpacing 2005 in terms of storm count, intensity-wise, 2005 is much, much ahead of us. Let's look at the basin overall. You can kind of see the activity flaring on up. We have an area here south of Florida, and you can see Gonzalo down to the south, and there's also a wave coming off the coast of Africa. I want to first point out where Gonzalo is located, because we haven't seen any storms thus far this season that have originated from an area called the Main Development Region out in the Atlantic. This is the breeding ground for 75% of all major hurricanes that develop in a season. And usually, this doesn't start to act up until August and September. So it being July is kind of an omen of what may be to come in an active season here, okay? We have to watch that very, very closely. We'll talk about that in a second. Our second is another tropical wave that has been coined Invest 91L. This is a pretty high potential now becoming possibly Hanna. If that system doesn't develop, we have a pretty robust tropical wave coming off the coast of Africa. We won't get too into that wave, but once it hits the coastline and into the MDR, the Main Development Region, it can certainly start to flare up as we saw with Gonzalo. So here's the latest update from the National Hurricane Center. 50-mile-per-hour winds. To be a tropical storm, you need 39-mile-per-hour winds or greater. Yeah, we're seeing that. Gusts up to around 65. And you look at the satellite presentation here. We're looking at the infrared satellite filter. What this tells us is the temperatures of the cloud tops. And why in the world does that even matter? Well, the colder the cloud tops means the stronger the thunderstorms, the convection associated with the system. And in the last couple of frames here, I want to bring your attention to the cloud tops that are white and black. That's indicating very cold cloud tops, meaning that the convection is getting stronger, the storm itself is intensifying. So it's way out there in the Atlantic, right? How in the world do we know that those winds are 60 miles per hour or 50 miles per hour with gusts of 65? How do we know? There's nobody out there. There's no ships going through. There's no people taking observations. We rely on satellite data. our eye in the sky, and we use something called a microwave scatterometer. And what this does, it scans through the clouds with reflection and scattering off of the ripples on top of the ocean. And from that, we can calculate the surface winds. It's kind of just a calculation or an estimate, but pretty close to there. Once we get a little bit closer to a coastline, we send aircraft out into the storm. And the last 6 systems that developed, they were closer to the United States, so we sent aircraft, and that actually verified it. So here's a look at Gonzalo again. Overall, its stature is very, very small. And so far, that has been helping this system, fending off very dry air to the north. It's almost insulating itself, protecting it, because this dry air can be pulled in and trained into the system and, in effect, cut it off, choke it on out. It needs to breathe healthily. Inflow at the surface, outflow aloft. And if it pulls in the dry air, it's just not going to be able to do that effectively. So far, it's been keeping away the Saharan air layer, dust or very dry air that originates from the continent of Africa that's sitting just to the north. Now, looking at it here on visible satellite imagery, you can see it's pretty healthy looking. Inflow at the surface, outflow aloft. It's ventilating properly and effectively. As it's moving towards the west, it's seeing the outflow bands here, dry air to the north. Right now, as the sun's getting ready to set on the system, it looks pretty healthy. And you saw on the infrared, the thunderstorm activity is flaring on up. Big question, where's it going? Well, the track of this system is pretty straightforward. And that's another thing to note with small systems. The track is pretty easy, but they are notoriously hard to calculate or forecast the intensity. So take whatever this looks like, either a hurricane or a tropical storm icon there with a grain of salt. But the track, most definitely high confidence, moving to the west-northwest towards the Windward Islands, the southern tier, north of Trinidad and Tobago. What intensity will that be at that point in time? Well, it could be a high-end tropical storm, or it could maintain a hurricane status. So small stature, hard to kind of forecast the intensity there. It is forecast, though, to become the first hurricane of the year. And if that happens, it's going to be about 2.5 weeks ahead of schedule there, because August 10th, on or around, looking at climatology, is typically when we see the first hurricane of the season. So we are just early all over the place. And there's really nothing to stop this from strengthening aside from the dry air to the north that, for now, is keeping at bay. As it moves to the west, its forecast track takes it into sea surface temperature waters that are well above what's needed for tropical cyclone development and growth. Okay, we need 80 or warmer, and we certainly have that there, 82, 83, 84 as it heads towards the Windward Islands. So that's not an issue there at all. Let's jump over to our second area of concern. This is Invest 91L, a very rugged-looking, broad rotation cluster of thunderstorms, really is all it is right now. But notice it is very large. It's pretty much taking up at least half of the Gulf of Mexico. And right now it has winds of 35 miles per hour, so under the criteria for a tropical storm. Switching it up and showing you water vapor imagery, mainly just to show you that dry air is not even going to be close to a problem for this, because you aren't seeing any of the dry air. You look for the brown shadings. Very, very moist atmospheric profile here, and it's looking pretty healthy as it's moving off towards the north and west, looking at least better than it did yesterday. On the visible imagery, you can pick out the very broad rotation here. As we go out further in time, that'll tighten on up, and we'll start to see a closed low form as it moves towards the north and west, because the environmental conditions for this are very favorable for it to grow. We have very moist atmosphere, low wind shear, and extremely warm sea surface temperatures, even warmer than what I just showed you what Gonzalo is going through. So here's the update from the Hurricane Center on the outlook with Invest 91L. It's up from where it was this morning, up to now high chances of this developing into the next named storm, which would be Hanna, 70% chance of that within the next 48 hours, 80% within the next 5 days. Where is it going? Well, this could certainly threaten the United States, most particularly the southeast coast of Texas as we get on towards the weekend. It's a very slow mover, so it's going to take its sweet old time, but it will also take advantage of the extremely warm sea surface temperatures and lots of fuel available for it to strengthen there. So we'll watch that closely. Look at these sea surface temperatures on its forecast track. 84, 85, 86 degrees Fahrenheit, running about 1 to 2 degrees above average. It's just cooking out there in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, before we wrap up, I do want to touch on the Pacific. We haven't really talked about that much. The Eastern Pacific season kind of got off on a slow start, and really overall it's well behind where we are in the Atlantic basin. But they just saw their first hurricane of the year, and this is Douglas. 75-mile-per-hour winds. You need 74 or greater to be considered a hurricane, so minimal grade Category 1. But what's interesting here is that in the next couple of days, by the end of the weekend, this is strengthening to a Category 2 hurricane, and then eventually weakening, but heading towards the Hawaiian Islands. Typically, that's pretty rare, but within the last 10 years of our very active seasons, Hawaii has actually been impacted by multiple storms. So this is not out of the ordinary anymore. It once was considered to be rare, but just not so much anymore as we get towards early Monday morning. Pacific hurricane names, they've only had 4 so far. 3 tropical storms, and then Douglas being the first hurricane of the season there. Whew, we had a lot to talk about. Hope you enjoyed it. If you liked the video, click that like button. If you want to see more, you can find us on all the other social media sites, on Facebook, on Instagram, and on Twitter. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.